A beginning is a very delicate time. Know then that it is the year 10,191.
Without change, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. The sleeper must awaken.
My father had acquired the rights to the book, and the book was one of my favorite books of all times. I had read, at the time, I think there were only 3 out. And so I very much wanted to be involved.
I thought it was a good book, but more important, I thought David was a good director. And these two things said, well, out of this, something good must come.
Well, when I read the book, I didn't really see how they were going to make a movie out of it. Then I read the script and saw that David done a pretty good job at sort of narrowing it down, but still keeping it pretty complicated.
When David Lynch got Dune, I think it was generally perceived that he got it because he was coming off the success of The Elephant Man, which in turn was a big surprise to Lynch fans, because before that all he'd done was this very strange cult underground movie, Eraserhead. So it was perceived as risky but exciting, and people their hats were off to Dino De Laurentiis for taking a chance with this sort of almost avant-garde director, but he had proven himself as a commercial director with The Elephant Man. There was a lot of excitement about this movie because, well, for one thing, from all the Frank Herbert fans. I mean, Dune was an enormous cult science fiction novel that people had been trying to make into a movie for years and years and years, and now they were finally going to do it. So the anticipation was very high.
I see the truth of it.
Could he be the one? Maybe. But will he be ours to control?
There are some books that should never be made into movies. Moby Dick is one of them. It's been made several times now, and it's never made well. Moby Dick is one of those things that is a book. Leave it as a book. As we say in Yiddish, lassen gehen, let be. Don't mess with it. There are some things you just don't screw with. Well, I always thought that about Dune. I thought Dune was one of those books that read well, and in the theater of your mind, your imagination could make it far more ebullient, more opulent, sexier, more adventurous, more dark and many-layered than you ever could in a film.
I always felt that one of the problems, or one of the mistakes maybe that we made, was to try and be too faithful to the book. It was such an incredible undertaking to just try and tell that story with all those characters, all those planets, all those worlds, and but we did it somehow.
You have to go with Lynch's movies on an almost unconscious level. They're really about imagery, and I remember the images of that movie 20 years later much more vividly than I remember, say, Superman, which was a huge commercial hit and was a lot of fun, but it doesn't stick with you the way that Dune sticks with you. And it's not about storytelling, because the storytelling isn't particularly great in the movie, and that's one of the reasons why it wasn't a commercial hit. But boy, as a visionary thing, even for all its flaws, I think it's much more interesting than most of the Hollywood science fiction fare. And one of the interesting things about it is how the iconography of it goes into the past. Well, it's actually wildly eclectic, because you've got some people dressed as if they were in like a Shakespearean play, and you've got other people dressed as sort of Nazi stormtroopers, and you've got Venetian architecture, and you've got Victorian trappings, you've got 1930s telephones. It's the most eclectic from a design point of view, and that's what's one of the things that's fascinating about it, is that it, but there's very little that's actually futuristic about it, and we generally assume that science fiction is going to be futuristic. And it is set in the future, but you wouldn't know it.
It was a difficult role to cast because he had to be young, he had to be princely.
This is the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohim. She is going to observe you.
And Kyle kind of, you know, worked after we saw many different people. He had that charisma.
Precise control.
Dune and I actually have a history before the film. I was a big fan of the books by Frank Herbert when I was, I guess I discovered them around 15, when I was 15 years old, and took to them immediately. I had never been a science fiction fan, really, but something about it, maybe it was because the age of the character in the book was similar to my age, 15 or so, that I really responded to it. Cut to about, I guess 8 years later, I was working in Seattle on a play. I just graduated from school earlier that year from my training, and I got a call. I received a call on my message machine in Seattle from a casting agent who had come to Seattle and was looking for unknown actors at that time to audition for the role of Paul. And she had called around to various theaters, and as I was performing there, I was sort of known at that time in Seattle, albeit in a very small capacity. And so my name came up as a potential, you know, auditionee, and so there I was. I met with a casting lady, Elizabeth Lustig is her name, and she recorded me doing this very odd audition because to that point I'd only been really stage trained and didn't really understand this relationship to the camera. But she was very encouraging and helpful, and she took my tape down to David Lynch and Raffaella De Laurentiis at Universal Studios in LA, and a few days later they called and said, "We'd like to screen test you." So I found myself on a plane, all expenses paid, from Seattle to LA. First time I'd been to LA, in fact. And that's how it started.
I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me.
McLachlan is not a great thespian. He is not Gielgud. He is not Sir Ralph Richardson. He's a perfectly competent actor. And in this case, he was young and I think a little frightened and did a perfectly yeoman job. But Franziska Annis and Max von Sydow and everybody else in the cast, the characters are so individual. Even Sting. Sting really, I will kill you. All of them were just the most wonderful kind of repertory company.
Frank Herbert was around a good deal, I remember, and always just, again, boy, is, you know, kind of that attitude, boy, isn't this great, you know? This is so much fun to be a part of this and to see this happening, and, you know, he would help with pronunciations, you know, from time to time, but he really, as I recall, didn't impose or, you know, himself on in any way. He was like just very happy to see his vision, you know, come to life, and in whatever form. I mean, obviously this book had to be altered a great deal, and he just seemed to be quite fine with, you know, whatever form it took.
He was always fascinated by the schedule. I spent hours scheduling with those little strips, you know, and he was fascinated by the fact that his book was turned into these colorful strips.
Frank was a strange man, but he must have been. He wrote Dune, didn't he? I said to him once or twice, explain something or other to me, and he'd say, "Oh, look at the index, you'll find it all in there." So I said, "No, but tell me what you think about it." And I don't think he could.
I remember doing 16 or 18 budgets for all over the world. We were trying, the things we needed were big stages, because we had all these sets that we needed to build, and we needed desert. So I did a lot of different, we did Italy and Morocco, we did England, and I can't even remember how many versions of budgets we did. And Mexico at Churubusco had these huge stages.
Often with dirt floors, but big empty rooms. And we went in and we just put sets in every one of them. I mean, we just filled them completely once and then basically knocked them all down and filled them again. We had so many sets.
It had everything. It really did have everything that we needed to make the film. The fact that it took so long was so complicated. When you come to consider it, the script was so complicated.
Dune is a story that's created in someone's head. There's nothing real. There's not a prop in the film that was a real thing you could buy in a store. Everything had to be made. So everything from the smallest, weapon to the largest set had to be built from scratch.
When we were in Juarez in the desert in high summer, and it was not so much a problem for us, we decided to work very early in the morning from about 5 until 1:30, and we called it a day. But that's mainly because the actors were wearing rubber suits and they were falling down like ninepins in the crowd, and so it was very unbearable for them for that period of about 2 weeks in Juarez in the high summer.
Some images I'll never forget. One was working with Max von Sydow on a stage, on the sound stage at Churubusco Studios, and we're all dressed in these rubber suits, and which were very uncomfortable. Designed by Bob Ringwood, who is known for using a lot of leather. He did the Batman stuff, and among many others, but they look great. And I remember Max standing there talking to Jürgen, and I looked down, and his hands, sweat was sort of dripping off all of his fingers it was out of the frame, but it was just this. And I thought to myself, oh, that's amazing, because Max is very imposing, he's like 6'6" or something, and, fantastic voice and very wonderful presence, and here he was, working, concentrating, and yet under great stress. And I said, oh, he's a trooper, I said, that's way to go, Max.
I'm sorry, Gurney. Not sorry enough.
What's wrong with Gurney? He's not making this.
Now, guard yourself from truth.
Is this what you seek?
Good. The slow blade penetrates the shield. But, look down. We'd have joined each other in death. You did seem finally to get the mood.
I worked for 6 months, kind of parallel with the main unit, but doing my own thing. Sometimes, very special, sometimes, very, very small, occasionally very, very big. But a fair number of special effects, things that today would be done as a digital optical, we did them for real as mechanical effects. It took a little longer, but you know, we were pretty good at it.
One of the stages we turned into a desert set, but the sand was made with micro balloons, which is balloons made of glass, but they're really microscopic to keep the scale. And then we had all these worms that were model worms that, you know, and we had to shoot very high speed, you know, to make it look, I mean, it was at the time groundbreaking.
I thought the worm was horrible. I really did. And we had all sorts of sections of it, of course, but we also had the full thing. I thought it was a hideous thing. I mean, it was done, as you know, by Carlo Rambaldi, who had done E.T., and that was a sweet little thing, the little thing in E.T. The worm wasn't. There was nothing affectionate about it at all, as far as I could see. Nothing at all.
One thing that was so hard was to make those eyes blue. We had to rotoscope each eye of every of the frame. Today that would be so simple.
I remember your Gom Jabbar. Now you'll remember mine. I can kill with a word.
We tried the contact lenses, and they were horrible. I mean, it was really hard, the actors, because there was a complete contact lens. They looked like one of those 1940 pictures with the giant ants, you know, it didn't look good. The other challenge that we had was that, you know, in the book, Frank Herbert says that Arrakis had no blue skies because there was no water. And that seems simple, but you know, that meant that even when we were outside, we could never really shoot just to see the sky. We always had to make sure that we could take the sky out and change it.
I devised a thing called the light flex, which was it's a very straightforward piece. It's like a piece of glass in front of the camera, which you illuminate. You light up the glass so it adds a sparkle to the whole thing, and you can control it. And after Dune, I used it on every movie, but this was the first picture I used it with, and I think it added a lot to the look of the picture.
My role was really not so much the big shots with the real people. It was the moments of a dream that we were interpreting differently, and often it was very abstract. The other thing that was really important in the film was water. I mean, the images of water were very, very important to Frank Herbert and hence to David. So we would try to find ways to capture water, but in a very abstract way. So all the water drops in the film, you know, the rings of water and all those things are images that we created with our little second unit.
I got to say, David Lynch was brilliant. He was so composed during the filming. I mean, I know we've spoken since, and I think at a certain point in time, I think he just felt like he was, you know, there was the light. He had entered the tunnel, and there was no light yet at the end that he could see. So he was just in this sort of period of time that seemed to go on forever. I mean, you remember he was there almost 2 years, I think. I was there 7 months, but they decided to do a lot of second unit and special effects shooting there as well. So he was there for at least 1.5 years, perhaps longer.
We had the advantage of having a lot of pre-production time out there doing tests, and so one was able to see all the sets being built, the development of each set and stages of the movie. So we had a lot on board before we actually started filming, more so than any other film. Normally Freddie would get 4 weeks preparation, I would get about a week testing. So you're living the movie before you actually start, and all the departments are coming together. They were building the sets and the special effects something like 2 years before we started filming. It was huge.
David is such an artist that he lives in his little world. That never bothered him, you know, the 2,000 people in the back. He was worried about what was in front of his lens. And sometimes that's what we had problems with, because, you know, I would have 2,000 extras in suits in the desert, and he was trying to shoot the close-up of Kyle's eye. And I said, David, you can shoot that eye, you know, in the studio anytime you want, but we got to shoot, that's why, you know, that's why we're here out in the desert. David never really worried himself about that.
David had wanted this black smoke, and the way to get the best look of this smoke is to burn these tires, which I guess you can do in Mexico, you can't do in America. But if you caught any of this in your lungs as you were sort of around, it froze your vocal cords or something, or you couldn't breathe. I mean, it was the strangest thing. So I remember doing a sequence with Patrick Stewart where, you know, we come up and you know, give each other a big hug. And on one take, I remember some of this, the wind shifted and some of this black smoke came right past us. And I remember going to speak to him, and I was like, nothing was coming out. I could not get it to work. I said, oh, Jesus God, what have I just done?
We had our own ways of working, and we continued to work the English way, the British way. We wouldn't let the Americans take over.
I have a certain approach where I stay very close to the director and expect my operator to be at my side and in my mind all the time. And this was the way I always operated, and it's the way Gordon goes about it. So we operate exactly the same way. I don't say, put the camera here, Gordon, put the camera there, Gordon. As a result of Gordon listening to the director and myself, he knows exactly what to do. So the moment we finish discussing the shot with the director, he's getting the camera lined up and everything connected with that, while I am getting all the lighting sorted out.
Freddie Francis, the DP, was a real character. He was helpful, but he wasn't really sort of the warm, cuddly, friendly type, you know. His first was Roy Lerner, I think. Freddie took perverse pleasure in sort of, you know, shouting out across the set to Roy to, you know, to fix something, you know. And Roy was, you know, pipe up, you know, right away, you know, it's like, done, you know. And it was kind of like, I don't know, what I would imagine, you know, turn of the century or before, you know, they're on a ship. He's a captain, he's first mate. Could be that scenario. They could have been somewhere in India. You know, the relationship it certainly was, it felt to me military in the best way, in that great English tradition.
It went on from March through till November of '84, so that's 7 or 8 months. David wanted a 3-hour movie, and Dino wanted a 2-hour movie, and Dino won. It was a fight to get it down there, and David was very reluctant to give stuff up, and I could understand why. But I think we found a good way out of it, and I think the picture stands up in the way it was finally worked out. But I know it was heartbreaking for David for it to come down to that length.
Raffaella is probably one of the very best producers I've ever known.
Oh, she was very knowledgeable and very efficient. You know, she'd been born in a film studio almost, and you know, she just went along with the run of things, and she was very efficient and a great friend and of all the unit.
That was the thing about any film on which you worked that has Raffaella with you. There was the greatest camaraderie in the world. There really and truly was. She is an astonishing person. She really is. And people will work their guts off because she's doing the same thing. She never expects anyone to do anything that she won't do herself.
I think when you're young, ignorance of sometimes make you achieve greatness, because you just don't know any better, and so you say, okay, well, so sure, I'll produce Dune. I want to produce Dune. Then, you know, it's only 10 years later that I found out that no woman had ever produced before Dune any movie that the budget was over $5 million. I had no idea.
The first time I met Dino was at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I went to the bungalow, and Dino came to the door, and he was eating pasta or something. He was having a late meal or an early dinner, perhaps, and he had a little pasta there, you know, so I stuck around, and I felt bad for disturbing him, but and I could tell the person I was with was a little nervous, but he was very generous. He said, come in, you know, in this great voice he's got. Sit down, you know. So I sit down on the couch, and he asks me like 3 questions, you know, 2 of which I can remember, which were, how old you are? And I said, at that time I was 22. He said, and he said something about, you cut your hair, or something like that. I said, well, whatever you need, you know. And he sort of stared at me for a while. And there was another question I can't even remember because it was just really very surreal. And he said, okay. And he got up, and that was it. I ended up hanging out pretty much. We were a little musketeers. It was Patrick Stewart, myself, and Everett McGill. We sort of hung out, went to dinners together and things. I mean, David would join us from time to time, and I would hang out with David a bit, but his obligations, were quite varied.
There was always something going on somewhere, normally in Raffaella's flat, I must say. In fact, Richard Fleischer was doing Conan on the next stage, and we were sort of back to back, and he came to our parties, of course, and one of the boys took some stills, and Richard looked at the developed stills. God, I didn't know I was at an orgy.
I bet you that the people who went to these parties had nothing to do with shooting the film.
Well, I met David Lynch at the American Film Institute, and we worked on a film called Eraserhead for many years. So I had built this relationship with him. He went on to do some more work, but then when it came to Dune, we hired Freddie Francis, who's a wonderful, wonderful cinematographer, to do the film, but thought that he could bring me on doing a second unit, doing some extra footage, some special things that David always had in mind for the movie.
I thought he was mad, and I still think he's mad, but he's a wonderful guy to work with and makes up his mind what he wants.
I thought he was terrific. I thought this bizarre outlook on life, and he's such an ordinary chap. Yet he's got all these weird and wonderful ideas.
I think perhaps there was a sense that we were sort of joined at the hip, kind of, or tied together in some way during this process. I guess I was, the hero of the film, obviously, and also sort of the focus. But I think there were a number of what's the word? There were a number of battlefields, I guess, or not battlefields. Let's call them. And there were a number of creative arenas. There were the Atreides, the family, Jürgen, myself, Francesca, Patrick, all that, sort of the good warriors. And then there were the bad guys, the Harkonnens, right? And that was a world that David, I think, secretly really preferred.
David is absolutely brilliant. He really is. He is a genius. He's a crackpot, but he's a genius. If the producer says, no, that's not possible, you'll find somehow 3 days later that not only is it possible, it's already been done. I'm terribly fond of him. I really am. I love him dearly.
However, the Duke will die before these eyes, and he'll know that it is I, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who encompasses his doom.
I think Dune was a victim of the expectations. People really wanted, you know, commercially they expected a big blockbuster. It was just too strange, I think. It was too unconventional. I mean, there's some very kinky stuff in it.
The great thing against Dune was that there was no humour in it. I can't remember even smiling once, and it needed humour, and there wasn't any at all.
There was a big backlash against it. You know, there was a lot of publicity about the movie before it opened, how it was going over budget, how they were having all sorts of problems in Mexico while they were making it, potential clashes between Lynch and Dino De Laurentiis, and the media kind of fed off that. So I think there was a certain amount of, you know, people smelled blood, you know, in the air, and there was a certain ganging up on the movie when it opened.
None of the critics, with the exception of David Ansen and myself, of course I was not a major critic, but my stuff got around, gave it a good review. It was almost universally panned.
I never read the reviews of the movies because even the good one makes you crazy. You know, it's just like you spend so much time on a movie and your intentions are such that, you know, it's so easy to sit down and tear at 4 years of your life. So I just don't read them anymore.
Critics think nothing will ever make a good film, except a good film. And, you know, it's a terrible thing to say, but I ignore critics completely.
My review was one of the only positive reviews that came out, which I do not apologize for, and I would write the same review today, I think. But I do feel that a lot of my colleagues kind of jumped on the bandwagon with undue viciousness.
You know, I love the film. I was surprised people didn't enjoy it more. I really was. I thought it would find a bigger audience than it did. I'm afraid it wasn't perhaps promoted as well as it could have been. I don't know that the studio really supported it. That's an unfortunate thing because I think it's a very beautiful movie.
I'll miss the sea. But a person needs new experiences. They jar something deep inside, allowing him to grow.
Most of what Universal did, in my view, is indefensible. They had no faith in the film. They had no chutzpah. They had no balls. They had no courage.
You know, a lot of people blame Universal, the way they released it, for the movie not being as successful as it should have been. I think the movie was challenging, you know. It was maybe too intellectual and too difficult in many aspects. It was not your obvious popcorn movie, but I think the book was that way, and I think that, you know, being faithful to the book, which is what we tried to do, turned out a movie that was difficult. But the people that love it, love it.
The choice of director for a film is always, it's an unusual process. I don't know that there's any best director for a film. I mean, I think David was a wonderful choice for this one. I think sometimes when the studio is looking for the broadest possible audience, they choose the safest possible director, and to their credit, they supported David in going out on a limb and choosing someone who may not have been the first choice for this kind of film, but the vision he brought to it is so spectacular.
You'd think that Lynch would have at least gotten the benefit of the doubt for trying something a little bit different and more original and very personal. Not a total success, obviously. But you know, these are the same critics who are always complaining about how formulaic Hollywood movies are, and then when something not formulaic comes along, they jump on the bandwagon and sort of kick it while it's down.
I think Dune turned him off making big budget movies because in a way you give up your freedom, you know, for creative freedom when there's so much pressure on you because of the budget, the time. And he said to me when he finished that he never wanted to do another big movie again, and he never has. He's always done smaller movie that he can control, and I think he's been really happy doing that. He's found, you know, his niche, the thing he loves doing.
This, I think, is one of the linchpins of Dune's importance, that it ever actually got made. It was a book that shouldn't have been shot. It was a script that couldn't have been written. It was a directorial job that was beyond anyone's doing. It was a production that would beggar the imagination and bankrupt 3 studios. It was a production that could not possibly be marketed in any way that anyone could understand or that they would go to. It didn't hit its audience. It looked like it insulted its audience. It looked like it defamed its originator, and yet the film was made. And yet the film remains. After all these, you know, we're talking decades here, this film still holds up. And when you go back and you look at it, you are drawn into it.
As far as I'm aware, Dune has never really come in for a major reassessment. It always had a couple of fans, strong fans along the way, and Harlan Ellison in the science fiction world, I know, defended it at the time. But it's kind of, I think, overdue for a rediscovery, and maybe some years down the way, they'll realize that it's a much stranger and more interesting movie than they thought at the time.
Father! Father! The sleeper has awakened!